The Vikings and their era, the land of cold weather and sea. In northern Europe, in the harsh lands of Scandinavia, where winters are long and dark and summers are short and cool, a people was born whose name became a symbol of fear and adventure. They were the Viking sea warriors, traders, and explorers. 9th century Scandinavia was a world of petty kings, chieftains, who ruled clans and villages. There was little land, narrow strips of fertile soil along the fjords, and beyond them, mountains and forests. The population was growing, and young warriors had to seek their fortune elsewhere. The Vikings built long ships called drakars. Their hulls were narrow but sturdy, and their masts and sails allowed them to move quickly across the sea. These ships could sail both on the ocean and on rivers. The drakar became an extension of the warrior himself, his means to wealth and glory. The first raids. The word Viking did not refer to a people, but to an occupation, a sea voyage, an expedition. Warriors gathered in groups, set sail, and went in search of plunder. In 793, the world was shaken by the news that Lindisfarne Monastery on the coast of England had been plundered by people from the north. A chronicler wrote, "Fierce pagans destroyed the house of God, shed the blood of priests, took everything of value, and carried off captives." This event is considered the beginning of the Viking Age. Since then, raids have become a regular occurrence. Every year, ships with carved dragon heads appeared off the coasts of England, Ireland, and France. The Vikings attacked monasteries and cities, taking gold and people. For Europe, it was a shock. The enemy came suddenly from the sea, like a storm. Neither walls nor fortresses could save them. The Vikings were agile, cruel, and knew no mercy. The image of a warrior. Samurai in Japan lived by Bushido, knights in Europe by a code of honor. Vikings had their own way, the thirst for glory and wealth. Their religion taught that the best fate for a warrior was death in battle. Once in Valhalla, Odin's hall, warriors feasted and fought every day after death, preparing for the final battle of the world, Ragnarok. Therefore, the Vikings did not fear death. In battle, they wore chainmail, helmets, and used swords, spears, and battle axes. The shield was not only a means of protection but also a symbol of honor. To lose one's shield meant to lose face. Traders and travelers. But the Vikings were not just robbers. They knew how to trade and build settlements. On their ships, they reached the Baltic, Rus, Constantinople, and even Baghdad. In Birka, Hedeby, and other centers, trade in furs, amber, silver, and weapons was booming. In the east, the Scandinavians became known as the Varangians. They sailed down the Russian rivers to the Black Sea and served as mercenaries for the Byzantine emperors, guarding their palaces. The Varangian Guard became the elite, and the Byzantine emperor himself trusted them more than his own subjects. Myths and beliefs. The world of the Vikings was filled with myths. They believed in Odin, the god of war and wisdom, in Thor with his hammer, and in Loki, the cunning and deceitful one. Their sagas included heroes and monsters, giants and trolls. This belief gave the Vikings strength. They knew that the world was not eternal, and that even the gods would die in Ragnarok, but a warrior's honor is eternal. Therefore, they strove for feats and glory, so that songs would be composed about them. Raids on France. In the 9th century, the Vikings became a real nightmare for France, which was then called the West Frankish Kingdom. The country was fragmented, the kings were weak, and the monasteries and cities were rich. In 845, Viking leader Ragnar Lodbrok led a huge fleet up the Seine. 60 ships sailed up the river, and soon Paris appeared on the horizon. The inhabitants panicked and locked the gates, but the forces were unequal. The French king, Charles the Bald, was forced to pay a huge ransom, 7,000 pounds of silver, just to get the barbarians to leave. After this campaign, the Vikings returned to Paris more than once. In 885, they besieged the city for several months. The townspeople held out, but once again had to pay to rid the capital of the Northerners. The French kings were powerless. Then they took a desperate step. In 911, King Charles the Simple gave part of the land to the Vikings. Chief Rollo converted to Christianity and became the first Duke of Normandy. A century and a half later, his descendants would land in England, led by William the Conqueror. England and the Kingdom of Denmark. England suffered no less from the Vikings. Already at the end of the 8th century, they were plundering monasteries, and in the 9th century, a real invasion began. The great pagan army invaded the country in 865. At first, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell one after another, but in the end, they managed to gather their strength and fight back. King Alfred the Great of Wessex managed to stop the Vikings by making peace. Part of England remained with the Saxons, and part with the Scandinavians. This is how Danelaw, the area of Danish law, came into being. Later, the Vikings not only plundered but also settled in England. They built cities, married local women, and merged with the local population. Their descendants became part of the English nobility. In the 11th century, the Danish king Canute the Great even united England, Denmark, and Norway under his rule. For a time, England became part of the Scandinavian Empire. Vikings in Rus. In the east, the Vikings were known as the Varangians. They moved across the Baltic Sea, entered the mouths of the Neva and Ladoga lakes, and descended the rivers to the Black Sea. According to legend, the Varangians played a key role in the creation of Rus. The tale of bygone years tells how the Slavic tribes invited Prince Rurik of the Varangians to rule and reign over them. His descendants became the rulers of the old Russian state. The Varangians were not only rulers but also traders. They transported furs, honey, and slaves, and brought gold, silk, and wine from Byzantium. Many Varangians served in the Byzantine army. The Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, became particularly famous. The tall northerners, with their axes, inspired fear and respect. Vikings, and the discovery of new lands. One of the greatest achievements of the Vikings was their voyages. They were not afraid of the sea, and knew how to find their way by the stars and the Sunday. At the end of the 10th century, Eric the Red traveled far to the west and discovered Greenland. There he founded settlements that existed for several centuries. But his son, Leif Erikson, went even further. Around the year 1000, he reached the shores of North America. The Vikings named this land Vinland, meaning land of grapes. This was 5 centuries before Columbus's voyage. The settlements in America did not take root. The Indians resisted, and the distances were enormous. But the very fact of the discovery makes the Vikings the first Europeans to set foot on the American continent. Vikings as rulers. Over time, the Vikings ceased to be mere raiders. They became kings and founders of dynasties. United kingdoms were formed in Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. In England and France, their descendants became nobility. From robbers, they turned into rulers. The end of the raids. By the 11th century, Viking raids began to fade away. There were several reasons for this. Europe was no longer as vulnerable. Kings and princes consolidated their power, built stone castles and fortresses, and organized standing armies. Now, a quick strike from the sea no longer yielded the same results. Cities knew how to defend themselves, and monasteries were no longer easy prey. At the same time, the Scandinavians themselves changed. Those who had previously gone in search of booty now began to settle in new lands. In England, Ireland, and France, the Vikings built cities, married locals, and adopted new customs. The son or grandson of a Viking was no longer a pirate. but a landowner or knight. Christianization played a special role. Christianity and the New World. The first missionaries began to penetrate Scandinavia as early as the 9th century, but their success was limited at that time. The Vikings worshipped Odin, Thor, and Frey, believed in fate and Ragnarok. They made bloody sacrifices to their gods, animals, and even humans. However, Europe gradually drew Scandinavia into its orbit. Christian princes understood that baptizing the Vikings meant not only saving their souls, but also securing their lands. In the 10th century, the Danish king Harald Bluetooth officially converted to Christianity. In Norway, the mission was continued by King Olav Tryggvason, and then by Saint Olav Haraldsson. In Sweden, the process took longer, but there too, the new faith prevailed in the 11th century. The baptism of the Vikings changed their way of life. Now the blood of human sacrifices was replaced by bread and wine in the church. Stone churches were built instead of open-air temples. Instead of jarls burning villages for gold, kings appeared who ruled according to the European model. The Vikings become kings. By this time, Scandinavia had united into kingdoms. In Norway, power was concentrated in the hands of the descendants of Harald Fairhair. In Denmark, a dynasty was established, whose descendants also ruled in England. Sweden slowly transformed from a loose federation of tribes into a unified state. The Vikings, once robbers and mercenaries, became the founders of dynasties, whose roots stretch to the present day. The modern monarchs of Scandinavia trace their ancestry back to these rulers. The demise of the old gods, but deep in the northern soul, the memory of the old gods lived on for a long time. Even after baptism, people told sagas about Odin and Thor, about the cunning Loki, about heroes and giants. These sagas were recorded only centuries later, in the 13th century, when Scandinavia was already Christian. But it is thanks to them that we know about the myths of the Vikings. Their cosmology was harsh and tragic. The world is the ash tree, Yggdrasil, whose roots go down into the world of the dead and whose crown reaches up to the sky. At the end of time, in Ragnarok, even the gods will perish, and the world will burn in flames, but a new world will rise from the ashes, and everything will begin anew. This belief taught steadfastness in the face of fate, and perhaps it was this belief that made the Vikings so ruthless and fearless. The final blow, 1066, historians often refer to 1066 as the end of the Viking Age. In that year, King Harald Hardrada of Norway attempted to conquer England. He assembled a huge fleet and landed in the north of the country. On the 24th of September, at Stamford Bridge, his army clashed with the Anglo-Saxon army under the command of King Harold Godwinson. The battle was fierce. The Vikings fought desperately but were defeated. Harold himself was killed. Just 3 weeks later, Harold himself fell in the Battle of Hastings, where the Norman Duke, William the Conqueror, a descendant of those very Vikings, conquered England. Thus, the Viking era came to a symbolic end. The last great expeditions were defeated, but their descendants became kings of Europe. The legacy of the Vikings. Although the era of raids ended, the Vikings left a huge mark. They discovered new lands, from Greenland to America. They created trade routes connecting the Baltic and the Mediterranean. They founded cities such as Dublin, York, Kiev, and Novgorod. Their legacy lives on in language, culture, and myths. The English language has absorbed many Scandinavian words. Scandinavian sagas have become gems of world literature, and in the popular imagination, the Vikings remain a symbol of courage and freedom. Their ships with dragon heads, their axes and shields, still inspire admiration. The Viking Age lasted only 3 centuries, from the end of the 8th to the middle of the 11th century. But during those centuries, they shook the world. They were feared by the monks of Lindisfarne, known in Constantinople, and their songs were heard on American shores. From robbers, they became kings. From savages, they became founders of states. And although their time has passed, their spirit remains. The world of myths. The world of the Vikings was steeped in myths. Their religion was not just a set of gods and rituals, but an entire universe where every element of nature had meaning. At the head was Odin, the father of the gods, the god of war, wisdom, and poetry. He was depicted as a one-eyed old man. He gave up his eye in exchange for knowledge, drinking from the well of wisdom. Odin eternally sought the truth, even if it meant sacrificing himself. Next to him was Thor, the Thunderer, protector of humans and gods. His weapon was the hammer Mjolnir, capable of crushing giants and always returning to its master's hand. Thor was simple and straightforward, but that was his strength. He protected the world from chaos. There was also Loki, cunning, fickle, deceitful. He could be a friend or an enemy. He wove intrigues, but it was his schemes that ultimately led to Ragnarok. These myths were not fairy tales for the Vikings. They were a reflection of life, the struggle against harsh nature, the thirst for glory, the feeling that everything would end in a great battle. Ragnarok, the end, and the beginning. The main myth was Ragnarok, the fate of the gods. On the day it comes, the wolf Fenrir will break free from his chains. The world serpent Jormungandr will crawl out of the sea, and the fire giant Surt will raise flames. The gods and warriors of Valhalla will face the giants and monsters in a final battle. Thor will kill the serpent, but will himself fall from its venom. Odin will fight the wolf, but will be devoured by it. The world will burn, the sky will collapse, and the seas will overflow their banks. But from the ashes, a new world will rise, green and bright. Few will survive, and everything will begin anew. This myth encapsulated the Viking philosophy. Death is inevitable, but even the gods meet it with weapons in their hands. Therefore, every warrior sought to die with dignity in order to join the gods in Valhalla. Valhalla, the Hall of the Fallen, was the dream of every Viking. There, warriors were greeted by the Valkyries, beautiful warrior maidens. Every day, the heroes fought each other, died and were resurrected, and in the evening, they feasted at the same table with Odin. This was the reward for bravery, eternal battle and eternal feasting. Vikings did not dream of peace, they dreamed of eternal glory, daily life. Despite their image as fierce warriors, the Vikings' lives were not only about war. Most of them were farmers. They plowed the land, grew barley and rye, and raised livestock. Women did housework, wove fabrics, and took care of the home. Scandinavian houses were long and wooden, with a hearth in the center. They were home to large families, including servants and slaves. Slavery existed, and captives from raids were often turned into slaves. But the Vikings also valued freedom. Their society had ting, assemblies of free men where disputes were settled and laws were passed. This was the prototype of future parliaments. Weapons and the art of war. The main weapon of the Vikings was the sword or battle axe. The sword was considered a status symbol. It was passed down from generation to generation and given a name. The axe was more accessible but no less fearsome a weapon. The shield was round, made of wood, with an iron umbo in the center. Its shape gave rise to the shield wall tactic, a dense formation where warriors covered each other. Not everyone wore chainmail and helmets. They were expensive. Helmets were decorated with simple overlays, and the famous horns attributed to the Vikings are just a late myth invented in the 19th century. Art and crafts. The Vikings were not only warriors, but also skilled craftsmen. Their jewelry, wood carvings, and weapon designs are striking in their sophistication. They loved intertwining patterns, stylized animals, and symbols of gods. Ships were the pinnacle of their art. Dracars were built so that they could cross the ocean and enter shallow rivers. Their bows were decorated with dragon or snake heads to intimidate the enemy. Memory and legacy. When the Viking era ended, their memory lived on for a long time in the sagas. In the 13th century, Icelanders recorded their legends, the Elder Edda, the Younger Edda, and sagas about heroes and kings. These books preserved the spirit of the Vikings. They echo with the harsh northern voice: fate is inevitable, honor is more precious than life, glory is eternal. In modern times, the image of the Vikings has been revived. In the 19th century, Scandinavian romantics made them a symbol of national pride. In the 20th century, they entered popular culture. Books, films, television series, music. Today, the Vikings are not just a part of history. They are a myth that lives on in the imagination of people around the world. The Viking Age lasted only 300 years, but its echoes can still be heard today. In every dracar found by archaeologists, in every saga, in every word that has come from the Scandinavian languages into the modern world, this harsh call can be heard. They emerged from the mist of the northern fjords, traveled across Europe, reached America, and left their mark on England, France, and Russia. They were robbers and traders, murderers and poets, destroyers and creators. Their time has passed, but their spirit remains. The Vikings have become a symbol of fearlessness in the face of fate. And as long as people tell stories of bravery, feats, and honor, the name of the Vikings will live on. Ragnar Lothbrok. Among all the names of the Vikings, one shines particularly brightly: Ragnar Lothbrok. His image stands on the border between history and legend. The sagas tell us that Ragnar was the son of a king and wore trousers made of rough leather boiled in tar, which earned him the nickname Lodbrok, shaggy trousers. He became famous for his campaigns in England and France, plundering Paris and taking gold and prisoners. According to legend, he was killed by the Anglo-Saxon king Ella, who threw him into a pit of snakes. Before his death, Ragnar said, "Soon the piglets will slaughter the boar," hinting that his sons would take revenge. Indeed, his descendants, Ivar, Bjorn, and Sigurd, launched a massive campaign against England, known as the Great Heathen Army. Ivar the Boneless. Among Ragnar's sons, the most famous was Ivar the Boneless. According to the sagas, he suffered from a disease of the legs, possibly rickets or paralysis, but he compensated for his physical weakness with mental strength and cunning. Ivar was a great strategist. It was he who led the army that invaded England in 865. His mind and cruelty inspired terror in his enemies. The chronicles say that he could be ruthless, but at the same time he skillfully commanded his army. Ivar died far from his homeland, but his name remained in the sagas as a symbol of the will that can overcome the body. Björn Ironside. Another son of Ragnar, Björn Ironside, became famous for his expeditions to the Mediterranean. His dracars reached the shores of France, Spain, and Italy. The sagas say that he even attacked Sicily and North Africa. His nickname, Ironside, spoke of his strength and fortitude. He became king of Sweden and founder of a dynasty that ruled there for a long time. Leif Erikson. Later, in the 10th and 11th centuries, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, became a new hero. It was he who reached the shores of North America. His courage opened up new horizons for the Vikings. Although the settlements in Vinland did not take root, the discovery itself was a great feat. Female warriors. The sagas also mention female Vikings. They were called shield bearers. Although archaeologists have long debated their existence, recent discoveries confirm that women were indeed capable of fighting. In Birka, Sweden, the burial site of a woman with a full set of weapons and a horse was found, proving that women also became warriors, symbol and legend. The Vikings left behind not only cities and dynasties, but also legends. Their sagas are full of fury and beauty. They echo with the voice of the north wind and the lapping of waves against the Drakars. Today, we remember them in books and films, but most importantly in archaeological finds. A Draco raised from a fjord, a sword dug out of the ground, an amulet with Mjolnir. All these remind us that they were real. Epilogue. The Viking Age is over, but it changed Europe forever. They destroyed and built, killed and traded, plundered and founded cities. Their descendants became kings and emperors. Their gods died, but their songs live on. The Vikings were people of their time, cruel but free, harsh but hungry for glory. Their story is one of courage in the face of destiny. And while the cold seas of the north echo with the whistling of the wind and the cries of seagulls, it seems that somewhere in the fog you can still see a long draka with a sail decorated with a dragon's head and warriors walking towards their destiny.